Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I should begin by saying that Dr. Potts and I do have some things in common. We both care very deeply about the sufferings that we have seen in the world, and we've both seen a great deal of suffering in the world. We both have experience with the complications of pregnancy. I miscarried 4 of my children, and I almost died in childbirth, delivering my oldest daughter, Juliet. In most of my debates, the justification of abortion usually centers on the claim that the embryo is not a human person, and the belief that abortion can reduce human suffering. Dr. Potts will likely show you a number of charts and graphs that attempt to prove that abortion, when it is legal, results in the decrease of abortion rates and decreases in the numbers of women who die in abortion and childbirth. I would invite you to read a very well-documented article which uses reliable data from the Pro-Abortion Guttmacher Institute, the World Health Organization, the U.S. Center for Health Statistics, and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control to refute Dr. Potts' claims. You can find it online at this website, healingtheculture.com/statistics. But frankly, my point is that I find the entire argument that we should legalize a violent behavior because the people who engage in it might get hurt or die to be very troubling as a red herring argument. What if I were to say to you that we should legalize child abuse because then abusive parents wouldn't fear that they would be reported for a crime if they took their child to a clinic or a hospital for proper care after the abuse? And I hope that you wouldn't buy that argument. Thank you. I hope that you wouldn't buy that argument. But I find that it's the exact same argument that's being made when we claim that destroying unborn children in the womb should be legal because fewer women will die from the procedure. If abortion is killing a human person who has equal dignity and worth to you and I, then it should be against the law. And it should be against our own code of personal moral conduct. We should work harder then to solve the problems that lead women to seek abortions in the first place. But beyond that, when someone tells us that abortion should be legal because it can increase happiness and decrease suffering, the first question that I think we should be asking is, well, what do you mean by happiness? And what do you mean by suffering? Because there are different kinds of happiness and suffering in the world, and they're not all equal. One kind of happiness in the world could be described as physical pleasure and material possessions. It's important, but it's usually considered to be the least fulfilling kind of happiness because it's very short-lived. It's not very deep. It doesn't use very many of your talents and skills, and it doesn't move outside beyond yourself. If we just live for this first level of happiness as if it were the ultimate objective of human existence, we will probably end up in a profound spiritual crisis. A crisis of the soul, if you will. Boredom, restlessness, low self-esteem, feelings like we're living beneath ourselves, a sense that our lives have no real meaning. A second kind of happiness you could identify as ego gratification. We can get this through achievement, such as winning, power, or popularity. Like level 1, it has its place. But the problem is that if it becomes our ultimate happiness, we typically end up in a constant state of anxiety, aggression, jealousy, fear of failure, suspicion of others, contempt for people who are weaker than we are. Happiness level 3 is deeper than level 2. It's the kind of happiness that comes from making a difference beyond myself for the good of another person, sacrificing my own good in order to tend to the good of someone else. It can be experienced through love, generosity, compassion, commitment to another person. It can be experienced through giving myself to some kind of a cause. It's a good kind of happiness, and it puts myself in a place where I look for what is true and just and good and noble, above merely increasing pleasures or possessions or ego gratifications. And then there's this fourth level of happiness, which comes from our seemingly common desire to seek ultimate, absolute truth, unconditional love, perfect justice, or eternal home, which you could call our desire for God. Now, I'm not here to get into a debate about whether or not God exists. My point is this, that if by happiness we only mean that we want to decrease suffering and increase opportunities for physical, material, and ego gratification, then I would argue along with Thomas Hobbes that life will become brutish, ugly, and short. But if by happiness we mean that we would like to help people achieve the heights of love, truth, justice, goodness, well, then that completely changes the way we're going to view important words in the abortion debate like success, quality of life, love, suffering, and freedom. You see, to someone with a predominantly happiness level 1 and level 2 perspective, success will be typically viewed as getting whatever I want when I want it. Quality of life will be seen as a measurement of how much physical pleasure I'm experiencing. Love will be seen as a mere feeling. Suffering will be useless unless I can use it to advance my own position. And freedom will be the ability to choose whatever I want, regardless of the consequences that it causes to others. I worry that abortion is driving us somewhat unreflectively to live for these lower kinds of happiness, that it's causing us to radically underlive our lives, and that it's causing us to miss out on far deeper interpretations of these words, such as the interpretation that the most successful people are those who have sacrificed everything in order to uphold what is true and good and just. Or the interpretation that the quality of your life has far more to do with your capacity to love and to experience faith or hope than it has to do with how many material possessions you have or whether you are physically healthy. Or the interpretation that love is being willing to do the good for the other above the good of myself. You know, I often hear the argument that every child should be a wanted child, and I would agree with this. But is it love to tell your child that if I don't want you, I can kill you? Would we say that to a 2-year-old child, or to a 6-year-old child, or a 16-year-old child? Now, I'm going to assume that most people in this class would choose to prioritize love above and beyond simply levels 1 and 2. That we would choose to prioritize justice and goodness above material and ego gratification. That most of us would agree that the gift of ourselves for the good of others is more worthy of us than sacrificing other people for the good of ourselves. That level 3 and 4, in other words, are more worthy of our prioritization than simply levels 1 and 2. If that's true, then you should realize that there's more at stake in the question over abortion than simply my rights or what's in it for me. It should be important to all of us to determine whether or not the unborn child is a full human person. Because if she is, then it ought to deeply concern us that it is legal in this country to kill a full human person. So is the unborn child a full human person from the moment of sperm-egg fusion? Well, the first important step to answering this question is to agree to the most basic principle of logic, that something cannot both be and not be at the same time, at the same place, in the same respect. It's logically impossible because the conditions of being mutually exclude the conditions of not being. For example, you can't be both alive and dead at the same time, the same place, and the same respect. You're either one or the other. To say that both can exist at the same time, at the same respect, with the same being, at the same place, is a contradiction. Now, can you hold a contradiction in your head if you want to? Yes, you can. But the problem is that you'll be defying the rules of logic, and it will be impossible to even carry on a discussion, let alone decide whether something should be legal or illegal. So my point is that an embryo cannot be a human person if you want it to be, and not a human person if you don't want it to be. It either is or it isn't. And in my opinion, to claim that we'll never know the answer strikes me as intellectually lazy at best. The second important step to answering the question is what we call the principle of objective evidence. We ought to be able to look at all of the evidence objectively. It doesn't do us any good to just assert that the unborn child is or isn't a human person. We ought to have publicly verifiable evidence to back up our claims. Now, you may have heard of the famous French geneticist by the name of Dr. Jerome Lejeune. This is the guy who discovered that it was an extra copy of chromosome 21 that was responsible for the condition we know as Down syndrome. In the 1990s, Dr. Lejeune provided objective evidence that the full human genetic code is present in the human embryo from the moment of sperm-egg fusion. And not just a human genetic code, but a distinct, individual, unique, unrepeatable human genetic code. In other words, it's biologically and genetically completely distinct from its mother and its father. What's more, The human embryo at the moment of sperm-egg fusion contains all of the information necessary to direct its own biological development in the way human persons develop. This would be impossible if that embryo were not a complete, organized, whole human being. One argument that's frequently introduced at this point is what's called a molar pregnancy. This usually happens when a normal sperm fertilizes an egg that has abnormally lost its own genetic material. These moles grow very rapidly and they mimic a normal pregnancy. But the problem is that no one would say that a molar pregnancy is a human person with human rights, and there's a good reason for that. Dr. Maureen Kondik, who is an expert in human embryonic development and an associate professor of neurobiology and anatomy at the University of Utah, explains. She says they grow as a chaotic mass of disorganized cells and tissues, all of which are unrelated to each other or to anything resembling a whole. They are a collection of human cells, but not a human organism. This is very different from a human zygote, which does act as an organized whole. Another common pro-choice tactic you will sometimes see is to show pictures of unborn children at her very earliest development. We're told that scientists, using very advanced equipment, cannot tell the difference between, say, a human zygote and a chicken zygote. Of course, if the scientist had access to the tools of a geneticist, they would be able to tell that there is quite a difference indeed. But regardless, the fact that scientists cannot distinguish between a human being and another type of animal by its visual appearance has more to do with the limitations of our physical observations than whether or not that being is a human person. And this is precisely why you need more than just scientists, doctors, and biologists to tell us what a human person is. You are not the sum total of your biological parts. You are more than that. And in a moment, I will give you evidence that you are far more than that. But another argument you will sometimes hear is that between 30 and 50% of embryos die before they are born, meaning that they are spontaneously aborted. This means they are miscarried. This argument is supposed to make us think that because many of us die before we are born, somehow this makes us all non-persons before we are born. But do you know what the percentage of people, the percentage of deaths is for people after they are born? It's 100%. All of us who survive the womb are going to die eventually. So does the higher statistic of death for those of us who are already born somehow make people who are born worth less than people who are unborn? The statistics don't work that way. At this point, abortion advocates sometimes try to make a distinction between a human being and a human person. What they argue is that since it is biologically impossible to deny the scientific evidence that at the moment of fertilization, a unique, self-organizing being of human origin exists, a human being, they claim that you can be a human being, but not a human person. Well, what is a human person? That is, what is a human person as distinct from a human being? Well, before you can answer that, we need to describe the term that we give to the moral intrinsic worth of human beings. This is what grounds our fundamental human right to be protected under the law. When you hear the word human person, it distinguishes a being of moral worth with intrinsic dignity that has protectability under the law. So can there be such a thing as a human being who is not at the same time a human person? That is, a human being who has no intrinsic moral worth and therefore is not deserving of protection under the law. Well, before you can answer that, we need to discern what it is that gives human beings our intrinsic moral worth. What gives us our dignity and rights under the law? Biology and genetics cannot be the only tools we use to define the human person, because they only focus on our biological parts and completely ignore the tremendous set of data that focuses on the things that defy the boundaries of science. Human beings are capable of self-transcendence, of bringing love into the world and eliciting love out of others. Human beings are capable of the unique potential to participate in acts of love, faith, hope, kindness, generosity, goodness, patience, forgiveness, compassion, creativity, and even self-sacrifice. These acts cannot be explained by science. They can be studied by science, but they cannot be explained as if they had some sort of biological parts, because they do not. By their very nature, they transcend the world of physics. What this means is that human beings all have a transcendent aspect to our nature, not just a biological one. And it's our transcendent nature that gives us our intrinsic dignity and our moral worth. It simply isn't possible for Dr. Potts to tell you that as a physician or an embryologist, he can prove that there isn't any intrinsic transcendent dignity and worth in an unborn child at any stage of development. Such a statement goes beyond the parameters of science, which deals with what you can see and touch. He can admit it as a belief, he can even claim it as a belief, but such a belief defies logic. Because once a human sperm-egg fusion has occurred, you have a being with the same potential to actualize a transcendent nature as you and I have. In fact, there's no other substantial change to that entity which would indicate that its transcendent nature occurs at any other time other than fertilization. If you try to put a biological criteria on when a human being becomes a human person, such as it has to have arms and legs, or it has to be able to breathe on its own outside the womb, or it has to be observable by the naked eye, or have a certain IQ, or it has to be a certain sex, or be a certain skin color, you will introduce completely subjective criteria that is arbitrary and has nothing to do with your transcendent nature. Have you ever met a person without arms and legs? I have. And he managed to manifest a beautiful transcendent nature without the use of arms and legs at all. My father couldn't breathe on his own without an oxygen tank for a whole year before he died. Was he not a human person because of this? My daughter's IQs simply do not measure up to my own. Do they deserve less protection under the law than I do? I've debated philosophy professors and physicians who make the arbitrary claim that an embryo is not a human person until the nervous system is fully functioning. This is a position that Dr. Potts has held. But aside from the inconvenient fact that your nervous system is not fully functioning until you're about 20 or 21 years old, what possible justification is there for excluding human beings from the category of human personhood simply because their nervous systems are still being formed? Apparently, they don't need a fully formed nervous system to do what human beings do at that stage. So why are we excluding them from human personhood on that ground when they contain the very same potential for actualizing the goodness of their transcendent nature as you and I have? Why would we exclude any human being on any biological ground if they have a transcendent nature just like we do? Why? Because they aren't using that nature to actually do any good right now, at this precise moment? Well, are you? I mean, isn't it the actualization of our it's not the actualization of our transcendent nature that makes us unquantifiably valuable. It's the fact that we all have the potential to actualize a transcendent nature. That's why we don't allow the killing of people, for example, who are asleep, or people who are zoning out in front of the television, doing nothing in particular to help humanity. Your potential to love is what is infinitely valuable. The evidence is clear that an unborn child is a full human person at the moment of sperm-egg fusion, because at that moment, nothing biologically different needs to be entered into the equation. This being at this moment has the potential to actualize a transcendent nature just as you and I. But just like almost every student in this classroom, that child is in a stage of biological development. Now, there are some who would argue, along with the 1973 Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade, that we can still never be certain about when human life begins. But even with all the evidence I just presented, if you are still unsure about whether or not the unborn is a human person, the most basic principle of all ethics, the principle of non-maleficence, should convince us that in cases of uncertainty, we must assume personhood and do no harm until someone can definitively prove otherwise. In ignoring this critical principle of ethics, our U.S. Supreme Court, in essence, said if you don't know whether or not something you encounter is a being of infinite worth and dignity, go ahead and kill it. Isn't that the same thing that the Spanish conquistadors did when they tortured, enslaved, and murdered Native Americans on the grounds that they didn't know whether or not the Native Americans were full human beings? How is that any different? How are we not reliving the worst parts of human history all over again with abortion? A second fundamental principle of ethics is that the ends don't justify the means. It holds that you cannot use an evil means to bring about a good end. Why not? Well, because the evilness of the means you may be using will undermine any good that you're attempting to achieve. We recognize the validity of this principle in almost every aspect of our lives. And yet, in order to achieve the good end of offering women more freedom, we've justified the means of killing unborn persons. As a woman, I find this offensive and insulting. I think we are intelligent enough to find solutions to paths towards women's freedom that don't include the violence against our own children. So then you might hear the argument that abortion can actually be good for the child because it will prevent untold suffering to children who have, for example, genetic abnormalities. Well, first of all, I wonder if anybody's ever bothered to ask these children if they would prefer to be killed than to live with their genetic abnormality. And maybe it wouldn't be so difficult for people to live with genetic abnormalities if the rest of us just loved them a little bit more. I've actually heard doctors justify aborting children with Down syndrome because since so many of them with children with genetic abnormalities die spontaneously before birth, abortion, quote, just takes the place of what nature has failed to do. I find it a perverse sort of callousness to claim that people with Down syndrome are a failure of nature. I know several people with Down syndrome. One of them, a young friend of mine by the name of Eric Matthews, testified recently in front of the Washington State Legislature about why we need more public education to help dispel the discriminatory myths that surround people with Down syndrome. I would encourage anyone who holds the failure of nature belief to spend time with people like my friend Eric. Like you and I, they certainly have their bad days, but they are also quite capable of experiencing the fullness of love. And they forgive us of our failures a lot easier than we tend to forgive them of theirs. Where is the good that will come from exterminating these humble-hearted, joy-filled people from our planet? To me, this isn't about a failure of nature. It's about a failure to love. Finally, there's the principle of natural rights, which teaches us all the way back in the 1500s that your rights to life, liberty, and property are natural to you as a human person. When do you get those rights? They naturally exist as conditions necessary for your transcendent nature, which means that when your transcendent nature comes into existence, your rights to life, liberty, and property come into existence. Which means that these rights belong to us at the very moment of spermic fusion. If you put up some other arbitrary dividing line between when human beings get to have human rights, you'll open the door to justify any dividing line, including those that may one day exclude you. So what's my final point? You were created more than just for yourself. What makes human beings come alive is our gift of self to the other. This gives us a transcendent dignity and a nature which defines the human person. And being that that's who you are, you get the right to life simply because of your beautiful nature. To argue otherwise would be not only to argue the biological facts about what a human being is, but the ontological data that shows us that an unborn child is a human person from the moment of fertilization and ought to be protected under the law. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me at the back all right? Good. So, I'm a physician, an obstetrician, and I have done abortions. I also have a PhD in embryology and did research in the first really human hours of mammalian development. So I want to talk about facts, opinions, and beliefs. Let's begin with some facts. Certainly, unsafe abortions, which are done by traditional means, can be 1,000 times as dangerous as abortions done by modern means or by medical abortion. But human development, I see as something of increasing complexity, and it's filled with errors. All of us, I think, Camille and I, would like to live in a world that has the fewest possible abortions, and one way to achieve that is obviously to make contraception very easily available. So I've got three core questions which overlap very much with what Camille was saying. Can we reduce human suffering? What are the facts about early development? And what do we do in a situation which is exemplified by two adults standing beside each other that can shake hands and smile at each other, but have different opinions? What do we do within society? How do we accommodate that? That's a very profound issue in any civilized society. So if we just look at Africa, where I've done a lot of work recently, there are about 6 million unsafe abortions each year. Those leads to deaths from hemorrhage and infection, lifelong infertility. There are about 26,000 students on this campus, and about 26,000 women die every year in Africa from unsafe abortion. So every time I look at this group, I turn all the men into women. Many of the women who die, and I've seen them die, are in your age group. And I know that with the technologies that I'm familiar with, that if I was permitted to use them, even in very, very low resource settings, like the places that I work, that we could prevent 95% of those deaths very quickly and very low cost. And I feel that that would be a contribution to human welfare and human happiness. Because it's my experience that when a woman's going to have an abortion, she will have an abortion even if she's going to give her life for it. So we have very firm data that everything that you do in medicine has a risk. About 200,000 people die from safe abortions, but up to 700 die from unsafe abortions. So in Africa, it can be 1,000 times as dangerous to have an abortion as it can be in California. To the best of my knowledge, that is the biggest disparity in human epidemiology, in facts. So there are two ways of doing, or there are several ways of ending an unintended pregnancy. One of them, which is fairly recent, is a medical abortion. You simply take 2 pills in the first sort of 90 days of pregnancy. And this gives women power over their own bodies. They can take this to their home. I think you should have somebody with you. And there can be complications. You may need to go to the hospital, you can lose a lot of blood, and you'll get a lot of cramping pains. It's never a pleasant process, but it's something that the woman can initiate and control herself. The other abortions are abortions which I've done, where another person with skills ends a pregnancy mechanically, and in the first 3 months of pregnancy, the most widely used methods are what's called vacuum aspiration, and I with an illegal abortionist, introduced the technique of manual vacuum aspiration, which will have been used today in UCSF, and probably. I'm astonished, having published this paper in, I think, the 1970s, that people are still using it, and probably many millions of abortions have been done by it. There's a discussion which you may wish to have as to whether the town centre should offer medical abortion. They currently refer people to other places if they have an unintended pregnancy to get a medical abortion. But I think it's part of comprehensive health care, and I certainly believe in preventive medicine. So, what do we know about abortion? Is the eye clicker working or not? Perhaps not. Anyhow, just make a sincere guess your answer to this. And let's try and be honest. So, who says 1 in 37? Okay. Who says 1 in 8? Okay. 1 in 19? I don't know. 1 in 3? 1 in 3 it is. Not 1 in 19, 1 in 3. 1 in 3 women in this room will have had, or may have in the future, an induced abortion. That is a very significant fact. Whatever else we can agree on, that is a fact. And that is why the discussion today is so important, and why it's also so important that we discuss it in a celebrate and respectful and loving way that we can. Because as Camille said, We both want the best outcome. So this is really an extraordinary situation where we're saying there's two very different solutions to get the best out of human happiness. So let's look at this a little bit more. So of every 100 pregnancies in the world, only 63 end in a live birth. 15 in a spontaneous abortion and 22 in an induced abortion. Again, these are very, very large numbers. This is a statement that when abortion is legal, you may end up having fewer abortions, which I think is true, not in all situations, but many situations. So this is actual data of the number of births in New York State to New York State citizens before the law was changed, and the number of hospital legal safe abortions that took place, minuscule. After the law was changed, there was a small decline in the number of births and a very large rise in the number of abortions. So clearly, by logic, many of those abortions there were previously taking place illegally. But so that tells us that when you change the law, a lot of unsafe abortions become legal. But what else happens? In the next year, there was a further decline in the total number of live births. There was a very slight rise in the number of legal abortions, which is not sufficient to account for that decline. So either people stopped having sex, which I think is improbable, or there was an improved use of contraception, which I think is what happened. So I would like to reduce the number of abortions. Romania is a country that I've visited, and I've met doctors there. And the communist countries of Europe had legal abortion, very widespread. It was one of the only sensible things I think Vladimir Ilyich ever did, was to change the abortion law. But there were a lot of abortions in Romania until the dictator Ceausescu came to power. And he thought that abortions and contraception were bad. So the grey area here is the total fertility rate, the average number of children a woman is having. So before, when abortions were legal, family size would average about 2, look across here. Then the blue line is the maternal mortality rate. The red line is the number of deaths from abortion. So when abortion was taken away in contraception, the birth rate doubled. But very slowly, the birth rate began to come back to where it had been before. Now that was done by illegal abortions. And as those illegal abortions took place, more and more women died from unsafe abortion, the red line. When the Soviet Union fell apart, Ceausescu was overthrown. People hated him so much he was murdered the next day, and the day after that they were so suffering so much they made abortion legal. The number of abortions is now in the yellow line because we can count them. There are a lot of abortions. Very slowly and welcomingly, the number of abortions has come down. It's now quite low, and that's because the green lines here, people had access to modern contraception, they were using it better and better. Those are real facts. There's also a very strong relationship wherever you look at the total fertility rate here and the percentage of women using abortions and the resort to abortion. The higher the contraceptive rate, the lower the abortion. So, of course, there are people who don't like to accept our facts, and I won't really comment on that more. But there are also people of great integrity. Surgeon General Koop was somebody who certainly would be classified as a right-to-lifer. He was very concerned, but it had been suggested that people who had abortions suffered from very many psychological problems. It's been suggested that women who have abortions have more breast cancer. And we all do this to some extent, I'm sure I do. We've got a particular point to make. We tend to take things which are fake news and use them to support our position. this happened. And Coop was asked to look at this, and he was totally objective, and he reported to the Congress that the number of psychological problems are minuscule from public health perspective. So he was a person who was asked, who had one particular faith position, and he looked at the data honestly, and that's, I think, what we should all do, and we should congratulate people who do that. So I think we know how to stop women dying from unsafe abortions and to make abortion less frequent. So when does life begin? So I see biological development as a continuous process. Fertilization is significant, but I don't see it as the sort of the only marker. I'm very conscious of the fact that every woman in this room had 500,000 unique eggs in her ovary when she was in her mother's womb, that you've lost most of the eggs by now. You release several thousand eggs, maybe a race to be the one that's released each month. Biology is extraordinary, over the top. I mean, everything is overdone. We've got fantastic numbers. The numbers of sperm that I've made while I'm standing talking to you make me quite tired to think about. We just make huge copies of our germ cells, and then we put them together, and sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. From the point of view of philosophy, law, just common sense, we have to make arbitrary divisions about continuous processes of increasing complexity. So I like to take the after delivery example here, that as we do become more mature, states differ on the age when you can drive a car, they differ on the age when you can marry, they differ on the age, we've had different laws about the age when you can vote. But everybody would agree you don't ask a 6-year-old to drive a car, and you don't ask everybody to be 60-year-old before they can vote. You make common sense decisions. But whether you can vote when you're 18, 21, 23 and a half, or 17 is an arbitrary decision that we have to make. And we have to make arbitrary decisions as in life and development before birth. I love this picture. When I'm in London, I go to the National Gallery to look at it. This is Crivelli's picture of the Annunciation. Here are the angels telling the Virgin Mary that she's carrying the Christ child. And what this tells you is that there's been a long philosophical history about when ensoulment begins, which is really the same as the transcendental philosophy that Camille was talking about. So here's the Virgin Mary, and here's a sort of thing in the sky to symbolize a divine source. And there's a nice convenient aperture in this building, a sort of laser beam coming down. And there's a dove here, which represents the soul. What this really tells you is that theologians, both Christian and Muslim, have argued about when ensoulment takes place. And most of that argument, certainly for most of the history of philosophy, was that it took place it did not take place at conception, but took place later. That is a matter of faith. There's two items of faith here. One is, do you believe in the soul? And second, if you believe in the soul, when you believe in soul that takes place. Those, for many people, are important articles of faith, but they cannot be proved or disproved. So, Bernard Herring was one of the most distinguished of the... I always regret not meeting him, because my mentor, Father Francis Xavier Murphy, suggested I should have done when I was away. It was a big mistake. But this is what he said. It's not belong to the data of revelation. So this is a nice blastocyst, a morula, the Latin word for blackberry. This is what the egg looks like when it's coming down the fallopian tubes, very shortly after fertilization. That was the area of research that I was focused on. I was looking at these in electron microscope. I was the first person on this planet ever to see a fertilized mammalian egg attaching to the uterus using an electron microscope. So I would say that there were no moral absolutes in human reproduction. As Camille said, there were a great many abnormalities in development, and the more we study it, the higher the proportions. This is from John Locke, who was also the man who invented the pill. And we've got data before the woman knew she was pregnant. There were women having hysterectomies, and he looked to see if there was an implanted embryo, and a remarkably high proportion of them were abnormal. And the more data we have is that 2/3 of fertilized eggs are destroyed naturally by spontaneous abortions. So I see abortion, spontaneous miscarriage, spontaneous abortion, as a natural healing necessary process. A natural healing necessary process. And most of my work as a physician is to amplify natural healing necessary processes. If you have a chest infection, it doesn't get better either. If your antibodies cure the same, that's fine. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So, and as has been pointed out, spontaneous abortions, when we have the capacity to look at them, include a great many abnormalities, chromosomal abnormalities. So Down syndrome is a trisomy. You've got 3 instead of 2 copies of that chromosome, of the smallest chromosome in the human genome. When you have trisomies of the largest chromosomes, they always lead to miscarriages because they would lead to such horrible abnormalities if they were born. So there was a screening process, which is extremely important. We really don't understand the nature of it, but when you are pregnant, the uterus somehow or other is screening the appropriateness of that embryo. And strange things can happen. You can have a second fetus that gets mixed up with the first one. This, I think you would all agree, is a picture of a very happy lady with a loved child. Every physician in the United States would have been sued in court if he or she had not killed that child during pregnancy. That is because that child was an ectopic pregnancy. Now, ectopic pregnancies you get in the tubes, or they can be outside, perhaps the liver or somewhere else, and if they're not treated, they lead to hemorrhage, and the woman can die. So we always remove ectopic pregnancies. But occasionally ectopic pregnancies go to term. This one went to term. Here is the MRL, and here is the uterus of that lady. It's totally empty. Here are the limbs and the parts of the fetus which is outside the uterus. It's a perfectly normal fetus, the product of sex, of fertilization. But we would have killed it. So there are no absolutes that I can see either in embryology or in the acts that we conduct as physicians or as non-physicians. That is a mode of pregnancy, we've talked about that, it's a product of normal sex, but it's all placental tissue. It's not a totally disorganized mass. It's very organized placental tissue, but there's no embryo. So all of us today, I think, are here because we respect the beliefs that cannot be proved or disproved, but are deeply held. And that's, as Camille rightly pointed out, the Supreme Court ruling Roe v. Wade does not say abortion is right or wrong. It says when those trying to, in the respective disciplines of medicine, philosophy, and theology are unable to arrive at any consensus, the judiciary at this point in development of man's knowledge is not in a position to speculate to the answer. It is an unknown. And people have strong opinions, including our present president. Children that are born to women who asked abortions and didn't get them, there's a small subgroup there, on average, but of course not across the board, have more problems than those that are not done. But I think that ultimately everything turns upon the wonderful First Amendment to our Constitution and to the noble, profound statement of Vatican II. All persons have a right to religious liberty, a right with its foundation is the essential dignity of every human being. All persons must be free to seek the truth without coercion. So we have to agree to disagree. And that, I think, is very important. And so we have to have exactly the discussion we're having in this room, because you have the freedom to decide, and you live in a country where the Supreme Court has given you that freedom. It's not said abortion is right or wrong, it says that freedom to decide whether you have an abortion or not is your freedom. And so my personal perspective is, I've done abortions. I think women know more about their situation than I do. I don't think they have a right to stand in judgment of other people. If they ask me to do an abortion and they're informed about it, I will do it. And I think we should have a public policy which continues to respect that. Thank you.
I respect both of the viewpoints that we were presenting with. I do have a question for you specifically. Do you feel that restricting abortion is a form of imposing your beliefs onto these pregnant women?
I'm a little hard of hearing because of the echo. Did you ask me if I believe that restricting abortion is a form of imposing beliefs on pregnant women?
Yeah.
No, I don't, because I didn't base anything that I said on my personal beliefs. Yeah, if I didn't see the scientific evidence that that the embryo is a human person from the moment of fertilization, then yes, I would agree with you. But my opinion is not based on religion. It's not based on my own personal thoughts or feelings or hopes or dreams. This is based on scientific fact and on logic. And so I don't think this is imposing a belief. I think this is having to face up to the facts that you have a full human person at the moment of fertilization. You don't have just one person in a pregnancy, you have two, sometimes three, sometimes more. Well, what do you do with that? I'm not denying that there are a lot of problems that come with pregnancies. I've experienced them myself. But I am saying that if we're going to be compassionate and just, we have to look at both persons and not just one. That's what the law is for. The only reason good law exists is to protect innocent persons.
I think there is an element of belief, because belief in the transcendent is a belief in the divine, and not everybody believes in the divine. I think when I die, which will be quite soon, that's the end of life. I've had an extraordinarily wonderful time on this planet. But I'm a product of an evolutionary system, and which has produced a very social animal, which can also be very violent. And that we all have a responsibility to other people and to try to make the world a better place.
I just have a couple of questions it's not really here. So one of them is regarding what are your thoughts on abortion for incest or rape?
The most harrowing experience of my life, which I don't often talk about, was offering abortions to women who'd been raped in the war of liberation in Bangladesh in the 1970s, because the pregnancies were very late. And so if a woman has been raped, I think that's a terrible crime. She's raped and pregnant, I think that's the worst thing that can happen to a woman. If that woman asks me to end her pregnancy, I would do that. And I would get reward as a human being, knowing that I have brought some degree of healing to somebody that's been through a terrible experience.
My answer to that question would be, again, you have a second person involved. So I have experience with sexual assault. I have been a victim of sexual assault in the past. I know many of us women have. And I've also walked the walk with a colleague who 2 years ago was raped and brutally left for dead. She conceived a child as a result of the rape, and I was with her through the agonizing nights when she would have nightmares and sleeplessness and have to fight through those nightmares. I was with her when she discovered that she miscarried the child she conceived as a result of the rape, and how traumatizing that was for her. So I know the trauma of rape. I understand that it's a difficult situation. But rape does not justify killing another human person to solve the rape. In other words, abortion does not unrape the woman. The problems are still there. They still exist as a reality. Sometimes you hear the argument that, abortion is a compassionate solution because then the woman doesn't have to live through the next 9 months of carrying this baby or taking care of this baby after the baby is born. But just think this through for a minute. If my friend hadn't miscarried, and then she had given birth to this baby who was a product of the rape, And then 2 years ago, or two or 3 years later, she decided that she couldn't handle the emotional trauma of looking at this child every day. Would we say at that point that it should be legal for her to kill that child? And I hope none of us would agree with that position. But if we wouldn't agree with that after the child is born, why are we agreeing with that before the child is born? Because you can't see the baby? Because it's easier? Because you don't have to acknowledge or admit what it is you're doing? If this is a full human being, which the biological evidence proves that it is, then you've got a real problem when you say that the way to solve our problems is by killing people. I would never advocate killing human beings as a solution to our problems, as desperate as they may be.
So my question was a follow-up to that. Do you still believe that should be the case if the person who was raped was a minor? Should they deserve to bear that burden, having to care for a child when they themselves are children?
I think you're asking me what if the case of if the person is a minor, if the pregnant woman is a minor under the age of 18.
Should they still bear that burden?
Well, I think that if a person is too young to have a baby, she's probably too young to kill a baby. So the effects on your body when you're young and you go through pregnancy and childbirth, there's no evidence that on a young child who is a minor, that having a baby is going to be any more detrimental to your body than when you're older. Now, I was 38 when I was 41 when I had my first child. And the older you get, the more difficult it gets. But I have nieces who have given birth to children at very young ages, and their bodies were far more capable of handling that pregnancy than mine was at 41 years old. So I don't deny that there are risks and complications and difficulties with pregnancy, and I don't deny that we should work on those problems, but I don't think that the solution to those problems is killing somebody. That's my argument. I don't see how it justifies killing a human being. Was that what your question was?
It was more so like, should abortion services not be offered to these young girls?
Right, that would be my position. I don't think abortion should be offered to anybody. I don't think we should be killing anybody's babies. I think that is a wrong thing to do. It should be against the law in a civilized society. Yeah. Let me ask you this question just in return. If you couldn't resort to abortion, do you think there are no solutions to this problem? You all have grown up in an era where you've been handed abortion as a solution to everything from rape to overpopulation to discrimination to racism to crime to everything. And it's almost as if young people today think that abortion, if you didn't have abortion, you couldn't solve these problems. I would challenge you to think beyond that. That comes from my generation and my parents' generation, who have caused us to think that abortion is going to solve all these problems. And all of these problems have gotten exponentially worse since abortion has become legal, not better. I think we can solve these problems without resorting to killing people, especially innocent children.
Why do you say things have become exponentially worse?
Well, I look at the world
The
today.
English abortion law was passed in 1861, when we hung people for poaching rabbits, when we flogged people in warfare. I think that.
But nobody claimed that those things would be solved by abortion.
We passed a restrictive abortion law, and I think the country was less humane than it was in the 60s when we reversed that law.
Now,
I don't see any empirical evidence that making abortion legal has made countries, societies, more evil. I think that more liberal, democratic societies are those that change the law. After all, it was Adolf Hitler, Nicolae Ceausescu, Idi Amin, some of the world's worst dictators who previously free, safe abortion situations. They reversed those.
Well, I didn't say that the world has become a more evil place because of abortion. What I said was all the problems that abortion was supposed to solve haven't been solved. They still exist today. Women still get raped. There is still crime. There are still other problems in the world, and abortion has not made them any better. You still have poverty, drastic poverty, and in many conditions of the world, it's getting worse, not better. Abortion is not solving those underlying conditions.
If I may, let's go back to the gentleman at the back. Were you asking the question because you thought abortions would solve problems, or were you asking the question because you were feeling sorry for the woman that had been raped and thought she should be helped?
feeling sorry for the woman being raped.
Yeah, I feel sorry for her too, but it doesn't solve that problem to kill her baby. To me, that just adds to her burden. It adds to the burden of society, and it certainly adds to the burden of the baby who has to die.
Well, what about the family's financial burden? You know?
So what about poverty?
You know, that they have to die to care for a child, and they didn't plan on that. You know, it's not just the emotional burden of having, killing a child, or choosing to have it. It's now, okay, they're going to have a child, and now they have to pay for it. This was never intended to happen. You know, she has to live with this the rest of her life.
Well, you're kind of mixing a whole bunch of scenarios in here, which, first of all, it's really important to realize that the vast majority of abortions in this country do not happen because of these hard cases. They happen because of a mere choice for a lifestyle. So these are not happening mostly on babies who are very sick or women who are very poor. Most abortions are happening on healthy women who have healthy babies and are not living in drastic, dire poverty and are going to die if you don't have an abortion. But my point is that you don't solve poverty by killing poor people. That's not the way to solve poverty. If you're going to say it's okay to kill somebody before they're born because they're poor, then why aren't we saying it's okay to kill people after they're born because they're poor? It doesn't make any sense to kill the unborn people. They eat less. So why aren't we killing poor people who are already born and are causing more of the problems for that woman when she has these children? We don't solve problems by killing people. There are other ways to solve poverty. What are those solutions? Well, there are legislative solutions. There are solutions with social services. There are solutions with nonprofit organizations. There are solutions on the neighborhood level and your family level. I was born into poverty. And my mother had 6 children living in poverty. But she didn't have to kill any of us in order to solve her problems. I think we could think beyond abortion as a solution to human suffering and human poverty.
There's a question over here.
So I had a thing, I came late, but I was curious, you mentioned that the fetus has been biologically proven to be human. I told you guys what the evidence was and how it's being defined in the literature that you're citing. And the second point that this came from what you had mentioned, I think that there is a parallel between some of the new birthing techniques that we have now, like individual fertilization and those types of things. With that kind of, I think, biological engineering that we've been doing, and to bring this a little bit more, considering that our body, our female reproductive system, naturally engages in miscarriages, there's a ton of miscarriages we may not even know of at certain time points. How would you respond to some of these other kind of biological engineering methods that we use for birthing techniques? So it's mostly not to get too confusing, but our bodies will naturally miscarriage, so why not also have a kind of unnatural way to get rid of a baby or a fetus?
Well, that would be no different from saying all of us are going to die someday, so why not just use unnatural means of getting rid of all of us? I mean, well, we're human persons, and human persons have dignity and rights, and so you don't do that because it's uncivilized. Just because somebody's going to die anyway or might die anyway doesn't mean that somehow justifies using unnatural means to kill us.
The End of Life Option Act begs to differ, but
no, I'm not talking about choosing to end your own life. We're talking, what you brought up was choosing to kill somebody else because they're going to die anyway.
We're gonna move on to the next question.
Wait, can we just get the biologically defined thing though? I'm more interested in that.
Sure. Science has proven since decades ago that all of the biological material is present at the moment of sperm-egg fusion to have a complete, whole, self-organizing being of human origin. And that's how you define a human being. A human being is a full, self-organized, whole being of human origin that directs its own development biologically. That's what the child does from the moment of sperm-egg fusion. Prior to that, you don't have that in a sperm or in an egg or in a molar pregnancy or any of these biological situations that Dr. Potts points out where it's gone wrong genetically. But in a situation where you have the organized whole developing itself in the direction that a human person develops, you have a whole unique individual being of human origin. Biologically, that's a human person, or a human being.
So that I think is the crux of the difference between us. Camille is using the way we often use language, but My point is that the early embryo is in a totally different situation than later in pregnancy or from this room. Imagine all of you in this room are fertilized eggs. In a week's time, all the people sitting down here will be dead. In 2 weeks' time, all the people up there will be dead. Only less than half of you will come to term. It would be such a different kind of world. You'd have different kind of morals. You'd have different kind of decision making. It is, I call a fertilized egg a fertilized egg. I call an embryo. I would never call it a human person. It has the right material for making a human person, but that person has not yet been made. And all of us carry in this room we carry enough sperm and eggs to replace the 7.4 billion people on this planet. Each one would be genetically unique. There may be lots of Beethovens and people in my testes and in your ovaries. But we don't look at that world that way. It is a mistake to take the logic that people have in rhetoric and apply it to embryology. I'm the embryologist. I'm the one that's looked down at a microscope. And I remember the first time I saw an egg attaching to the uterus. My eyes filled with tears. I was so awestruck that I couldn't see it on the microscope properly. These are absolutely fascinating things that we've discovered about human development within my own professional lifetime. And I'm thrilled by them, and we should understand them, and we should take them in, and we should use them in making the difficult decisions that 1 in 3 women in this room and 1 in 3 men that loves a woman in this room will have to make in her lifetime.
Dr. Parks, none of your arguments dispute the fact, though, that you have a being of human origin here, and the fact that some of these may die has nothing to do with the essence of what they are. I mean, you haven't argued any of that, and all of us are going to die. So does that mean that none of us are human persons in this room, and none of us should be protected under the law? Your arguments are illogical.
Did you still have a question? Down here. Do you still have a question? Okay.
So this is from Molly, actually. So that psychological abortion is but I don't believe that you touched on the psychological effects that an abortion could have on women who are forced to not have an abortion. So I was wondering, do you think that making abortion legal could have negative psychological effects on women?
I don't think that the psychological effects that abortion can or cannot have on a woman has anything to do with whether or not you have a unique human person who has a right to life. Yes, there will be psychological, emotional feelings and problems and consequences for women who have abortions. Yes, there will be emotional, psychological complications for women who may not be able to get an abortion and want one. We all have strong emotional, psychological feelings about the issue right now. But what I'm saying is that our emotions and our feelings should not dictate whether or not you are a human person, whether or not you are a being of unique dignity, and whether or not you have rights under the law. Once we allow that, once we say emotions and feelings dictate whether or not you have rights, you have just justified every evil that has ever been done to a human person, born or unborn, based on the fact that somebody had strong feelings about it. I don't think that's the right way to ground our law. I think it's very dangerous.
I have seen those feelings. I've seen women in tears. I've been able to do a 5-minute operation and change the whole trajectory of their life. Every woman in this room would realize you're going to be professional women, you're coming to university. If you've had a pregnancy at a particular time, you've been forced to carry that to term, the rest of your life would be totally different. And I've actually found it quite rewarding having that sort of power. It's just a gift to help people make the decisions that they want to make about their own bodies. So our difference is whether we think a fertilized egg is a human person. That's using 2 words to describe something which I think are inappropriate. You are human persons, but not an egg, not a blastocyst.
Not an egg. I would agree with that. I'm not saying an egg is a human person.
Okay, we'll go over here. If you can specify whether you want an answer from those speakers or you're directed at what you might be able to answer all the questions after.
I'm gonna ask a question about the both speakers.
I'm going over there and then you can go next.
About like the right to life. I guess like a situation that I was thinking of that might kind of confound this is if based on the medical situation the woman is like basically guaranteed to die if she does give birth. In situations like this, and why would abortion still not be?
Okay, so you're talking about the life of the mother, if the life of the mother is in danger because of the presence of the unborn child. Dr. Potts, who are you? Towards me? Okay, well, in this situation, human rights are organized. They organize themselves. So you have the right to life, liberty, and property, right? And they're all inalienable, natural, fundamental human rights. But they order themselves. So property is underneath the liberty right because you have to be free over yourself before you can have ownership over property. So when we have a conflict between a liberty interest and a property interest, the liberty interest would win out because without it you can't have the property interest, right? Well, the same thing is with life and liberty. Life is a necessary condition for the very possibility of liberty. So if you have a competition between a liberty interest and a life interest, the life interest has to win out simply because without the right to life, you don't have the right to liberty. But your question is, what about if you have a life right against a life right? Now what do? Well, in this situation, a pro-life OBGYN would try to preserve as much life as possible and would never seek to kill a human person under any circumstance. One of the cases that this can happen is, for example, in an ectopic pregnancy where the baby is lodged in the woman's fallopian tube. In this case, if you don't remove that baby, the baby will never get the chance to grow to the point where he will be viable. And by the way, if you could wait until the moment the baby is viable, you would do that because then you could save both the mother and the child. But if a doctor had reason to believe, good reason in his medical judgment, as best as we could tell, that the woman is going to die imminently if you don't remove that baby, yes, you can remove that baby to save the mother's life. But the reason why is because you're not killing the baby. You're removing the baby from a situation that is pathological for both of them. Since he's not viable, if the woman dies, the baby will die too. So the first step to save her life is to remove the baby from her body. The fact that we can't take the second step in these early pregnancies to save the baby's life too is not killing the baby. It's what's practically known as a secondary and unintended consequence. If we ever came up with a technology where we could move the baby safely to the woman's womb without risking her life again and save the child, you would do that, but we can't do that today. So you take the first steps that's necessary to preserve as much life as possible without taking an active step to actually kill somebody. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I think that.
sorry. Just like a follow-up, like isn't that like in a sense then like pro-choice? Like in like situations where it seems reasonable to have an abortion?
Well, it would depend on it would depend on what you mean by the word pro-choice and abortion. In this case, you are ending the pregnancy, but you're not killing the baby. You're taking the first step necessary to save the baby's life too. So you're trying to preserve as much life as possible. So, Dr. Potts is very concerned about how we use words, and I think he's right. You have to be careful about what you mean by abortion and what you mean by pro-choice.
Go ahead, and then we'll go up there.
So I want to hear debate is creation versus Darwinian, and that Darwinian evolution, because you're talking about Darwinian evolutionary development versus transcendence, and I find the debate itself. One thing, like Mozart was composing at 6, so the memories he had in the womb probably contributed. Musical memories contributed to that. But I don't have any memories from being in the womb, so if someone took me out when I was in the womb, I don't have any memory. But at the same time, the Darwinian approach, at what point does that consciousness reach you? Like, at what point does the human mind enter the person? Like, an animal doesn't talk about its great-great-great-grandfather. Human beings do. At what point does that capability exist? And at the same time, how extreme is the discussion you're doing?
How extreme is the what?
The idea that we're going to make sanctify the idea that most of us don't remember anything in the womb. And so, anyway.
Are you asking that question to me or Dr. Potts or both?
No, I'm just bringing up the polarized debate, Darwinian thought versus creation. And I think there's a certain debate going on. The question is man animal or man human?
Well, I don't think you need to bring Darwin or creationism into this debate at all. I think you need to simply look at biological facts and logic to get to the point that the unborn child has the full human genome, is an organizing whole, and has the same potential for self-actualization through transcendence that you and I have. So I don't think that's a Darwinian argument. I don't think that's a creationism argument. I think that's an argument from biology and science and from logic. But your other question was about what we remember in the womb and at what point that has to do something with the debate of abortion. Is that what you meant? Because I don't think it matters whether or not you remember what happened in the womb. I often don't remember what happened last week at my age, and that doesn't have anything to do with my personhood, does it? I mean, is that what you mean? At what point does memory have to do with our personhood?
No, I'm just curious where do you stand on the nature of human life?
Okay. Yeah, I would say that nature begins at fertilization.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so this is a question for both of you. We've talked a lot about transcendence and like the potential to like actualize transcendence and like I understand the point that what differentiates humans and non-humans is like love and like I don't know, gratitude and things like that you've been talking about. But it was kind of my understanding that the reason that humans are able to have those kinds of things like love is like a neurological thing. It's like through hormones and neurotransmitters, and it's like a process that occurs in the brain. I was wondering what like biological facts we have on whether or not those same neurological processes occur in embryos, given the fact that those structures like the brain and things like that are so minimally developed. Like, do those neurotransmitters still flow? Like, how does that work?
The brain takes some time to develop, and so do the hormones, so there's no evidence whatsoever that even a fetus of 6 months would have any of the empathy or transcendental properties that we're talking about.
Or a 1-year-old, or a 2-year-old, or a 3-year-old, or my 4-year-old.
So you're saying that like a 4-year-old doesn't have like serotonin?
No, I'm saying that she's still biologically developing neurologically, and so her capacity for empathy is not as strong as mine. The capacity of a 1-year-old for empathy is probably non-existent as far as something she could actualize right now. Her potential is there, and my argument is it's that potential for these transcendent gifts that makes you valuable, not just your actualization. Yeah. Yeah, it's your potential to love and do great acts of justice that makes you valuable right now sitting in that seat, even if you're not actualizing that right now. And that's why we don't kill you. Because you are valuable as you are right now. I think that's why the law protects you sitting in that seat.
Okay, so just like a quick request for your opinions on like particular compromise.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can you hear him?
Okay, well, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, just like I'm just asking for like just opinion from both sides on a particular compromise. So in June this year, the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, scientists there were able to like actually develop a premature lamb through a bit of its gestation period inside an artificial womb. So like, I mean, I know like there was some mention that like our generation has like maybe a not as good approach to like finding solutions as previous generations. I mean, I think only history can tell, but like we are like this generation is seeing a lot of the technology, a lot of like emerging technology coming out in probably like the last century. So like, what would you think about if we could like actually develop devices that you could use for developing fertilized eggs into full human beings
in that method? Yeah. Dr. Potts, I don't want to monopolize Q&A.
First of all, I mean, I think it's a valid question, and I think there are ethical considerations in all the things that we do to manipulate reproduction. In vitro fertilization is a good example of that. I was very close to Bob Edwards, who has a Nobel Prize for in vitro fertilization. And it was criticized by some people he actually received a letter from the Pope at that time, congratulating on what had happened. Later, the Catholic theologian said you shouldn't do in vitro fertilization. I think it's a very, very important technology that has brought happiness and well-being to millions of women, fathers, and children that are born by IVF. There are other things which we would have to be more careful about. I think in 100 years' time, we might have some sort of artificial womb for the later parts of pregnancy. I think it's technically very difficult because we have a very strange placenta, which is bathed in the mother's blood, and it'd be difficult to do that. If we had such a thing, I think we'd make many of the decisions that we make about very expensive technologies. Are we denying other people basic care because we're spending all the money on this very expensive technology? I personally wouldn't go down the road of making an artificial womb, but no doubt somebody will. But I agree that technologies are important and they should be seen in an ethical framework.
My answer to that would be that, whether or not those technologies should be used, whether or not they're ethical, is a completely different debate to what we have today. But if you use those technologies and you end up with a fertilized zygote, with a fertilized egg, with a new, unique, organized whole, that being would have a transcendent nature and would have an intrinsic dignity and should be protected under the law, just like one that is conceived in the womb. Again, whether or not we should be doing that is a different debate, and it would be a very good debate to have. But they would still be human beings and human persons, and we would be required to treat them as such. Dr. Potts is wrong when he tries to assert that the Catholic Church has ever affirmed IVF technologies. It has never affirmed IVF technologies. What it did was to acknowledge that the dignity of the human person who is conceived through IVF technologies is very real and should be protected under the law. That's what was being said.
I'm going to go with this because I got a question here and then we'll go back there. So this person says, I have a friend who went through the American foster system and claims that the abuse and injustice of the system made her question her existence. Many kids in the U.S. are pushed into the foster system after anti-abortion programs in certain states are forced upon teen mothers. My question is, should abortions be offered to prevent cycles of poverty, abuse, and depression found in the U.S. foster care system?
Could you read that last part again? Should abortion be
offered to prevent cycles of poverty, abuse, and depression found within the U.S. foster care system?
No, abortion doesn't solve any of those problems, and those are terrible problems. Why aren't we solving the problems that exist and are intrinsic to foster care? We should be solving those problems, not killing children, because if they're born, they will become victims of those problems. With or without abortion, you're still going to have children who escaped abortion, who are still going to be victims of those problems. So we should be solving the problems of foster care, not killing children who may become its victim. It's a good question, though. I think it's a dialogue we need to have as well. Dr. Potts?
I think it's a good question, and I would approach it in the following way. Camille said some time ago something I entirely agree with. Most abortions in this country are not hard cases. They are women, and usually their partners, that have made a decision that they cannot give the child, if born, the love which they know every child deserves. And in the case of foster children, I'm sure what this person is saying, we have a very, very painful, broken system, and that would certainly would not influence me when doing an abortion, because I will only do an abortion that a woman wants. It would influence my emotions when I've done that procedure, and I would go to bed that night feeling that I've done something very positive and very good in doing that. Sometimes you do abortions and you think, well, I shouldn't be doing this, and you should always be asking. But I think it's very relevant to look at those issues, because a child is so precious and every child must have the love that it deserves. That should be our priority.
Yeah, we'll go up there and then come down here.
So you mentioned rights to life, liberty, and property, and those are clearly very contextual rights defined here in America. So first of all, how do you contextualize your position based on the society that we've grown up in? And then also, both of you, I guess. And then also, is prioritizing life over quality of life more important taking into account that I feel like with life, the only right you are truly entitled to by nature is death.
That is an interesting point, and I would completely disagree with that last statement. I would fight for your right to life to the death, because I think you are that valuable. I wasn't really sure I understood your first question, how you would contextualize our positions in the current environment. I'm not sure I would contextualize it any differently than I did in my talk. Your point was that rights to life, liberty, and property are American contextualized concepts, but they're really not. These concepts go way back to Aristotle and Plato. They go back to Francisco Suarez in the 1500s. These go back to Spaniards and Europeans, and there's concepts of human rights that exist in Mexico and in Africa. So these aren't just American concepts at all. So I'm not really sure how to address the contextualization argument.
Just the language, specifically that, the priority, I guess how you rank what your rights are and what you decide what your rights are, those are all things that are socially constructed, whether it's today in America, influenced by those people thousands or hundreds of years ago. Those are all very social.
So the prioritization of human rights is not contextualized to the culture you live in. The priority exists as a reality intrinsic to the nature of the rights themselves. So it's a necessary condition of liberty that you have life first. If you're a dead body on the ground, your liberty interests are a moot point because there's no life. So life is a necessary condition for the very possibility of liberty's existence. Liberty is a necessary condition for the very possibility of owning property. If I own you, you have no liberty, I own you, then by default I own all of your property. So the prioritization of these rights is not a cultural concept. It's intrinsic to the nature of the rights themselves. It's the only way, by the way, that you can resolve a rights conflict non-arbitrarily and objectively. If you use any other criteria, like who's born already, who's more powerful, who's stronger, who's more politically powerful, you're going to end up introducing criteria that we've used in history, and it's caused egregious harm, and we now know that it's wrong to do that. You've got to err on the side of the prioritization of the rights themselves. That's my argument anyway. You should be objective and not arbitrary in your application of human rights, or you're going to be in big trouble and justify a whole bunch of things that we don't care to justify today.
Camille and I would probably agree on the philosophical basis of human rights. Where we disagree is I don't see an embryo as a human person. If I did, then I would not do abortions. Because
and if I did not, I would be on this side. That really is where the argument lies. Is that little being a full human person or not?
I think you guys made it very clear that I think Professor Paul's stance that women's life is more important than the potential of what could be. What we're doing is equal as possible. So my question for you is, someone brought up the medical example earlier, if the mother might die once the kid makes the gap. What if you have a situation where the case where the child lives, the mother will die because she's given birth, but if you terminate the mother would live, but the child would die. In that case, who's fine?
Can you explain that last part again? If you had a situation where the child would live but the mother would die. Well, are you saying that the mother is going to die because the child is living?
Because she gave birth to the child. Because she has
I see what you're saying. No, well, again, if the child is viable, you could deliver that child, save the mother's life, and save the baby too. It's when the child is non-viable that in that case you have to prioritize, and the prioritization is save as much life as possible. And in ending the pregnancy and taking the baby out of that situation, the baby's going to die, right? So if he's non-viable, you can't save that baby's life if he's non-viable, and you remove him from his life support system. So the mother would die and the baby would die because she's his life support system. So you can save her life by removing the child. My point is that you shouldn't be killing the child. And I would never argue that, you choose one over the other. A pro-life OBGYN would attempt to save as much life as possible.
Reproduction presents some tragic choices sometimes. You can have a situation where you have two twins, and the heads of the twins are represented by my hands. the first twin is coming out of the birth canal, but the second twin's head is caught behind it. You have to cut the head off the first twin to save the life of the second twin and to save the life of the mother. And I've never had to face that problem as an obstetrician. I know an obstetrician that had to face that. And you have to make a decision in a minute or so. So sometimes we kill people to save other lives.
We're gonna take a last remarks from both of you since we're coming up to the end of the class. So if you do have any more questions, you can definitely talk to speakers after class. We don't want to keep everyone here after the class is done. Just final remarks.
So my final, I didn't understand your question at first. I have a friend, her name is Dr. Sue Rutherford. She's an OBGYN, she's been in practice for over 30 years. And for almost all of those 30 years, she's been, her field has been fetal maternal medicine. She's only dealt with high-risk pregnancies, where either the mother's life is threatened or her health is threatened because of the pregnancy, or the baby is very, very sick and is going to die. And in only one of those cases in all of her 30 years did she ever have to perform a procedure in which she had to remove the baby early and the baby died as a consequence, only once. It was extremely rare. But if it is necessary to take an action to remove that baby that ends up resulting in the death of that baby unintentionally when you're trying to save all human life, then that's an unintended secondary consequence. What you can't do is deliberately choose to kill one person in order to save another life. So my final remarks would be that I would encourage you to look at this question from where Dr. Potts and I both asked you to look at it. Is this being a full human being and a human person with the potential to actualize a transcendent nature? If it is, then abortion is a very serious, egregious harm. And if it isn't, then it isn't a question at all. But if you have a transcendent nature, by the way, this isn't a religious argument, this is a philosophical argument. If you have a nature that comes alive through love and generosity, and you consider that those things are what make life really worth living, then I don't see how you can deny the dignity of an unborn child who has that same potential that you do.
I think that's, first of all, thank you, Camille, for coming in, and that was very eloquent. I think my final remark is very simple. The Supreme Court, in a profoundly important and I think very wise judgment, said you have to decide whether you think an embryo is a human person or something else. You have to make that decision, and why I think we're proud to be with you tonight. And we can sleep, I think, a little bit happy because we've shared with you, I hope, with dignity and respect, why we've come to different conclusions, because you need to make that decision. And some of you will have to make that decision in very, very real terms. And some of you may have made it already. But I'm thrilled by this task and inspired by the privilege of being at a university filled with wonderful young people, and I think Camille sees that as well. So I'm going to applaud you because you're so good.